G'day there. You're watching the Aussie BIM Guru, and today we're going to start off the year's videos with a non-technical video, and actually one of the most common questions I've got both during my break and probably just during my whole time in sharing my knowledge. And that is how to get started with BIM and what are viable BIM career pathways. So I'm going to break these down in a video, but of course this video really is of course aimed more towards graduates or people starting off their career in the AEC industry. I have a background in architecture, but I'll try to keep things fairly neutral, with the understanding from you that of course most of my experience comes directly from the architectural side of the career journey. This is also for people considering things like studying BIM or transitioning into a BIM role. I will finish this video by talking about how you can negotiate your way into a BIM role, but more to come on that later. So it's really mostly addressing the common question I get, which is how do I get a job in BIM or a specific job in BIM? I get a lot of people saying, how do I become a BIM manager? Or maybe just how do I work in BIM, which in itself is a little bit of a flawed question, and I'll run through that quite shortly. I do have a lot of videos on general BIM management on my channel. I think there's about 7 of them. 2 of them deal with my own personal career journey and lessons I learned along the way. Of course, this isn't a journey through the industry right now. It's the industry of 10 years ago. So not all of it is relevant. So this will be a more relevant video for today. I also talk about general pros and cons of working as a BIM manager, rough salary expectations in my market, and whether you should study BIM. Hint, no. So let's just jump straight in. I do talk quite fast, so if you do have trouble understanding me, feel free to change the playback speed of the video. I think it goes all the way down to 0.5 while still making audio. So if you need it, there it is. So we're going to deal with that question. Also just talk about where do we even begin if you want to start a career in BIM, the typical roles and pathways that currently exist in common practice, whether you should target discipline versus BIM experience and when you should do that, the future of BIM, and also just how you could negotiate your way into a BIM role. So let's start with the main question. How do I get a job in BIM? Now this is already a question that's a little bit flawed in the fact that you're asking for a job in BIM. Is BIM a field? Is it an industry in itself? Not really. BIM is not really a job unto itself. You can't just work in BIM. You need to understand what your role is, what you want to actually do. And I question anyone coming to me with this saying you need to better articulate what role you actually want that relates to BIM. BIM as well is not really an industry. It sort of is in that it supports people as businesses sometimes in consultancies, but really BIM, the way most people are targeting it, they're really looking at it more from supporting a company. So working with an architect or an engineer or a builder or a client with a BIM focus. So really there, it's better to actually target the primary industry that you're trying to tackle there. So if you're looking to join, say, an architectural company in BIM, don't just present your goal to work in BIM. Present your goal to work and learn about architecture, but framing it through BIM itself. Get a job as an architect before you get a job as a BIM role in an architectural firm. It's really still the necessary way to deal with entering the profession. Sometimes in response to that, a very common query I'll get is frustration saying, I just want to work in BIM. You're not listening to me. I just want BIM. You've got to take a step back and really think about this. What is BIM? What do you want to work in if you just want to work in BIM? Well, BIM at its core is all about information management and all the processes related to driving this. Of course, there is software to enable this process, but it's a much bigger picture than that. There's a lot of experience that comes with this. You need to understand how projects work, how people work on projects, as well as how data needs to be exchanged in a secure and reliable way as well. And from this, you need a lot of experience and intuition. A company isn't going to hire you as their BIM manager from day one, because first of all, you don't understand their company, you don't understand architecture, engineering, etc. They're going to want you to learn this before they give you the chance to specialize in BIM. So if this is something that you want to say, my advice to you is typically take a step back and think about what sort of company would want to hire someone with that sort of attitude. You need to really think about how you get to that point rather than start at that point. Another retort is, but I'm good with a platform, a specific one. Most commonly Revit, of course, because most of my audience uses Revit. But as always, knowing a platform isn't really necessarily just the only way to get into a role. That's great that you know a platform, and I commend you for learning it. But do you know how to use it professionally? Like, do you have good standards? Are you going to be able to work in a team? Who can reference your experience? Are you just relying on certificates off Udemy? If you are, great, no one cares. Like, I hate to say it, but software-based certificates don't actually really get firms very excited because typically their core business service isn't just using software. They're going to be much more excited if you can prove that you have competency through working on projects with people. And if you're in a graduate, that's fine. You've never worked on a project. They're going to understand that, but don't pretend that you can skip that experience just by knowing how to use the software platform. It's not the same thing. Find a way over time to add context to your experience. So rather than saying, I can use Revit to make a building, say I worked on a X-story hospital and I used this software and this software and this software to deliver it. We ended up with a great outcome, and you can actually sell it in a way that a firm will understand what you're giving them. Focus on why, not just how. So don't learn just how to model a wall. Learn why a wall is laid in a particular way. Learn about the ratings that go with these systems. Learn about how this ties back to project delivery and coordination. There's a much bigger picture than just modeling when it comes to BIM. There's a lot of knowledge that goes behind this, and every choice should be fairly conscious in nature. So where do you begin? I mean, I've given you a lot of hard realities there, but let's actually give you a reality. Day one, in a role in most sectors, you're usually going to be just starting off as what you might call a technician, a drafter, a modeler, a designer. Typically that role is going to change depending on the company you work at. And it's not actually very common these days for that initial role at a firm to be clearly defined as a BIM role. They sort of just understand that everyone has a little bit of experience with BIM to some degree. And you're going to figure out what you want to do through your first 1 to 5 years in the company, most likely. So you might all be called designers, but you might still be using BIM software or engaging with BIM processes. This is really common, especially in architectural firms where they don't really give titles at the bottom of a company. You're all just designers, or they keep it very broad. And this is to benefit you ultimately in being able to better decide what you want to do and not get locked into a career pathway too early. They understand that people are going to change their mind, especially early in their career, and a generic title is often a good way of enabling that to some degree. So don't see it as a hindrance if you're not necessarily called a BIM technician. If it bothers you that much and you really want to be recognized as one, usually you can talk to HR and they'll probably let you be titled something else if you really want. But it's usually against what they're trying to give you as a career pathway at that time. So at this point, you can probably expect to work under a project leader, probably not a BIM manager. You're not going to be that directly engaged to the BIM support services of a company at this point, because really you're only just getting started. It's better to learn about how projects are delivered, how buildings work, how your discipline functions, before you really focus on the intricate BIM systems that go into supporting that at a BIM level. I'll be honest, you're mostly probably dealing with documentation and some modeling to support that, but documentation is probably the brunt of work that most graduates will deal with early on in an industry. If anyone tells you that you shouldn't be doing any documentation or that the industry is old-fashioned, that's great, but you've still got to have a job, right? So as nice as it is to say that this is all stupid work and no one should be documenting anymore, the reality is that that's still how the industry functions, and anyone telling you otherwise, in my opinion, is being disingenuous to you. Do expect to be doing some of this work early on in your career, but take it as an opportunity to learn about what you're documenting and what you're modeling. Ask questions, be inquisitive. Don't just do red line markups and just do people's, move this wall, fix this. Ask why. Why are we changing this thing? What's the thing that caused this? You'll start to learn more about design and coordination through just being more inquisitive. It's how I learn. And of course, you'll just naturally come across project delivery and coordination needs. You'll learn about how documentation sets go together, but you'll also learn about how we exchange information through cloud platforms and other related things that come with just working on a project team. And in time, this can lead to you choosing a more specialized pathway. One of the most commonly known steps is to go into a BIM Model Manager role, which we'll discuss soon. It's not the same thing as a BIM Manager per se, unless it's a very small company. You might become a senior technician. In working as a drafter slash modeler, a lot of people find they have a specialty in a particular type of modeling or drafting. For example, facade. A lot of architects specialize into a facade specialist off the back of their initial role. And this might be its whole career pathway unto itself that's less focused on BIM and more about making sure that things are technically detailed correctly or done in a way that can be understood by a contractor. There's a lot of different pathways down there, but they're less focused on BIM, more focused on project delivery and technical specification. As well as this, there are non-BIM roles. You might just become an architect off the back of this that doesn't really deal with BIM very directly. Typically, you'll be in a bit of a mixing bowl in companies when you begin, and you could go down a BIM pathway or you could go completely down a non-BIM pathway, all from the same role that you start at. They try to keep people pretty generic, like I said, when they begin. So don't expect to just necessarily become a BIM manager just because you wanted to on day one. This is still a level of the company where you can pivot quite quickly and easily towards different roles. I usually say you're going to want to spend about 3 to 5 years in that area, and you're like, whoa, like 3 years as a grad, as a junior, that's so long. But in the broader context of your career, it's not much. And understand that part of your career is very safe in terms of not having to be too responsible for things, being able to make mistakes and errors and not really bear any consequence for them except for learning. You're going to have a lot of support, hopefully, at that level as well. You'll have middle managers who are helping you, so take advantage of that. But once you get to around years 3 to 5, I usually say, you're going to go probably into what's more of a middle management capacity, where you will usually still be working with projects and project leaders. But if you're a BIM-focused middle manager, you'll often be actually managing the BIM models themselves, the standards, making sure they're working, keeping them clean, keeping them correct, and guiding your team or your junior techs, like what you used to be, in actually delivering this project. Chances are, if you've learnt a lot about your discipline, you'll probably also be just teaching juniors about your discipline as well. Just because you're in a BIM-related role doesn't mean that you should stop learning about your discipline and help other junior people learn about it. That's probably one of the most valuable skills of middle managers. They can disseminate a lot of information to the team naturally, but also on behalf of the project lead, who's often less available. As well as this, you'll probably still be quite hands-on. So probably still doing a decent amount of modeling, delivery, maybe documentation, but probably more with emphasis on coordinating with the broader picture of the project. So you might be the one actually sharing all the information over the common data environment. You may also be taking in information from other consultants and looking at it in a viewing environment or actioning coordination outcomes. Usually more complex modeling would be expected. From here, given that you are in middle management, you could go on to a BIM manager role. I usually say around year 8 is a pretty common time for people to make that step properly. You may be able to go earlier, it depends. And of course, you could go into a specialist role where you do something more specialized with BIM, but less focused on management. Of course, you can still go to a completely non-BIM related role. In fact, this is probably the most common role where people decide whether they really want to specialize in BIM or not. Because at this point, you will be quite involved with projects typically and leading to some degree how those projects are delivered, and that can naturally lead you on to become a project leader. Some of my best friends in the industry have went from BIM model management to project leadership instead, because the traits that you develop in those two roles are quite similar. Even though one is more focused on BIM, you're both still very much focused on the delivery of the project, the coordination of the project, and a successful outcome. So usually year 8 to 10, thereabouts, I would say, and yes, that's a long time to wait. But again, if you want to skip that, it's hard. The BIM Manager is probably the first pathway that is still commonly understood by most firms. Most firms understand what a BIM Manager is now and why they do or don't need one. Not every firm needs a BIM Manager. But you would typically be working more directly with the business now and understanding its goals, where it wants to go in the future, how it's going to get there. You're going to set standards and administrate, run business cases, test software, make sure the business makes the right choices in where they move. By this point, you'd probably be quite hands-off in not really dealing directly with projects, because hopefully, depending on the size of your company, as you've been moving up this company, you've been leaving behind people that are, moving up as well, and filling those shoes that you were leaving. So hopefully there's, new talent coming in, filling the technical level, and then they're moving up to model management, project leadership level, and that sort of naturally just fills behind you. If you're moving beyond these roles, but your role isn't really changing, chances are you're not actually moving into the next role. The company's just given you a position change to keep you, so do be mindful of that. But when you work in BIM management, the main projects you'd expect to be involved with directly are very complex projects that might be technically or programmatically or spatially demanding, and they may need just someone with that experience available from time to time. Now from here, you can go pretty much two paths, I would say. Depending on the size of your company, these are going to vary, but you can, of course, just move out of company environments like I did and become a BIM consultant. I did that for a few years, and it is a viable pathway, but you're going to need to attract clients. There's a lot of challenges that come with it. I do recommend checking out my consulting video if you want to hear more about that. But you can, of course, work your way through the company's management structure to make BIM a more well understood component of the company's operations. And to do that, usually you'll need to form a sector lead or principal role, which puts you at the level of the principals in the company. That way it's understood this is actually a core component of the business. It's not just something that we do on the side. And this is usually reserved for companies that are a bit larger, where there is enough BIM going on in a recognized aspect to make this a justified role. Of course, you can go full maverick. You can become the BIM specialist. This is sort of what I am right now. I've really picked a specialty path where I really am setting my own path and telling the company what I do and what I think is important and how I do it. It involves you being very transparent with your goals, but also with your plans. That way the company can sort of move with you. You can't expect a whole firm to just drag their feet behind you. It's almost like the other way around. You've got to just tell them where your feet are going. But you would nearly always be involved in complex tasks and projects. This is where you're less focused on the management of BIM in the company and you're more keen on how does it actually get done? Like, how are we doing this? And a specialist is typically someone that can make this work in most environments. One thing that specializes people is dealing with automation and programming. And you might have noticed I haven't really mentioned programming up until this point. A lot of people, they learn Dynamo at university. They're like, this is great. I want to do this from day one. Again, it doesn't really work because you don't understand what you're automating. So typically you probably wouldn't be dealing with any meaningful automation in the AEC industry until you reach middle management at least and have an understanding of what you're automating. But BIM specialists, you'd be at the point where you can automate most workflows that you think matter. That's really the key. And from here, you can, of course, just go and become a BIM consultant again or pick a whole different pathway. This is a very exciting role to me because you really are in the unknown. So there are lots of unrealized roles and opportunities that come with this. It's a little bit scary because, it means you're probably the first head on the chopping block sometimes. So you do have to make sure that people understand what you're doing and where you're taking them. But there's a lot of opportunities that come with this. But you can't start as a BIM specialist. It just doesn't work. And pretty much anytime you want, you can go into the unknown. That's the thing. This is an interesting industry. We're in an interesting time. There's a lot of disruption, a lot of changes on the horizon. So you can just become whatever you want, whenever you want, as long as you can back it up and actually make it work, right? So if you want to go and do something completely different, like become a software developer, go for it. But you're going to have to make it work in your own way. You're probably going to have to work with other people like you, left field thinkers, people that are really challenging the norm. And you might end up just leaving the industry altogether because these interests might take you well beyond this industry as a whole. These can, of course, lead to profit and financial freedom, mental freedom. But of course, if it doesn't work, it's a huge risk. It's loss, it's challenge. There's a lot of issues if you haven't planned it out. So if you do want to go into full left field career pathways, great, but have a good plan. Know it's going to work to some degree, take some risks. But yeah, if it doesn't work, just understand you're going to have to claw your way back into this industry and it can be quite difficult to do it. So there are a lot of questions that come after this often from people. One is, can I get to a specific role more quickly? I don't want to take 8 years to become a BIM manager. How do I get there faster? Yeah, you can. There's some exceptions to that though, of course. You're going to have to work a lot harder, a lot smarter. Like you can't just get more certificates in software and expect that to matter. You're going to have to learn things that matter, and you're going to have to make sure people understand that you've learned these things and you can actually back up having less experience. You're going to have to prove yourself. So you need new skills. There's going to be less mentors along the way because you're just doing it in less time. You're going to be challenged by a lot of people if you try to do things quickly because people won't understand you. They'll think you're risky. They'll think you're taking too many risks too quickly. They'll think that you're a know-it-all. Trust me, because I'm pretty much describing what I used to be like when I was starting off my BIM career. I was a bit of a know-it-all. So you'll need to back yourself up a lot along the way. You'll need to learn how to articulate and communicate why you still have sufficient experience despite having less of it overall. A lot of people say, should I just go and study BIM instead of actually getting experience? You can watch this big long video, but I'll summarize it in one word: no. And that's a very direct answer, as you can tell. If a firm has no BIM roles available, this is actually quite common. There's a lot of reasons this happens. The most common one is you're in a small to medium firm with very tight margins, so BIM isn't really recognized as a business component. It's more just something you have to do, and no one really gets recognized for doing it well. Some firms just want things to be simple. BIM can be complicated. There's no time to build a template or standardize, and maybe you just weren't hired to do a BIM role in the first place. I mean, that's a very hard thing to escape in a company. If you were hired as an architect and you want to become a BIM role and they say, no, we need architects, you may just have to go and look for another job. But I always say, don't try to change your firm's mind straight away, because they'll need to be shown that this could work if you do want to become a BIM role. I always say that there are lots of firms out there, but at least try to make it work in your company before you look elsewhere. Don't just say, oh, I want to be a BIM manager, and they say no. And you go, okay, and you just go and look for a job tomorrow. Try a bit harder than that. And you have to frame it in a way that a business will understand. Don't just say, I want to be a BIM manager, and not even explain to them how that will help their business. So if you do want to renegotiate your role to a BIM role, which is a common challenge, make sure that, of course, you understand there's going to be some challenges with this. One of the most common ones is maybe you want to go into a management role and you're really mostly dealing with technical tasks. If you're really good on the tools, people are going to tell you to just stay on them, of course. That's a big challenge. How do you escape that? Are there people that can fill that role behind you? Or are you literally leaving a void in a project or a company by doing this? Often there's already a BIM manager, so you've got to figure out how you work with that BIM manager, because you're not just going to want to oust them as the BIM manager. That's never a good look. Work with them and figure out if there's a more refined culture of BIM that you can help support with them at the company. Understand that BIM often isn't seen to generate direct profit. It technically doesn't. It's a support service for the most part. Unless there's literally a BIM related project like a BIM consultancy. So you're going to have to articulate things in a way of how value is returned to the profit generating mechanisms of a company. What are the things you're going to do in such a role that will help drive the business forward? Sometimes you will just be faced with a pretty brutal thing, which is just, we don't need it. We don't want it. Usually if you hear this, it's a good sign. You're probably going to be wasting your time for some of this time you put in. But it might be a challenge saying, tell us why we need this role. If they just say we don't need it after that, then yes, you might be talking to a brick wall. But it is a common thing for someone to say, at least at the start of a discussion, but just see it as an invitation to extend that discussion further. I usually recommend, if you are going to try and renegotiate, come ready to negotiate. Come with what you want in your head. What's your time balance between project and non-project work? What is your role? Write out a job description if the company doesn't have one. And what is a career pathway that comes from this role? To give them the confidence that you will stay and make this work. You'll need to say what value the role generates and how the firm actually can generate value from it in the future. And of course, what key changes do you want to work on in the firm that you think sort of justify the role in turn? So it's a real challenge, but it's definitely something you'll have to think about if you're looking to start a career pathway in BIM from a company that doesn't necessarily just do BIM as a standard service. And from this, let's say you've got a BIM role. Great. It's important to think about the future of BIM and its roles. And this is a much bigger topic that I might have to talk about in future videos. But expect BIM to change. There's going to be new ways of doing things, new ways of looking at things emerging every year. I think that BIM, as it comes by the books, for example, just doing it in Revit, is being seriously challenged, and I think there will be challenge put to it over the next few years, and it already is getting challenged quite significantly. So even if you learn to do things one way, don't expect that one way to be relevant in 5 years, say 10 years time. For example, I used to be really good at using Navisworks. I used it on projects, and over time I've just noticed most firms don't really use it anymore. So some of your skills you need to recognize when they're not worth improving or maintaining. That skill I've almost just let go to some degree. I could pick it up again if I wanted to, but I've said I'm not going to go and become a master clash sorter because there's already software coming out that does a better job than that. Reviz do. There's also lots of new tools and techniques emerging on the market. So just understand that if you just know one platform, like, a small applause for you, but it's not enough. You need to be multifaceted in your skills, and you need to not tie your skills just to a platform. Make sure your skills can be done in other places as well. Because companies change, appetites change, markets change. Don't just always expect one software to rule the market, because chances are it probably won't. I think that it's important to understand that working in BIM is not just a clear way to future-proof and protect your role to get financial stability. It's not necessarily that simple. You might be redundant at some point in the future in BIM. I hate to say it, but I can see the writing on the wall. Margins are getting tight, economies are getting tighter, and I think the next few years are going to be seriously challenging for BIM-related roles to justify their place. Not saying that they're not needed, but a lot of firms are going to make the first cut in the non-project teams when times get tough. So do really go into BIM wholeheartedly if you want to do it, because you will need that passion to drive you through the hard times as well as the good times. I'm not saying we're all going to get fired next year, by the way. It's just a reminder that nothing's ever a clear ticket when you work in a company. So keep yourself upskilled and aware, no matter which point of your career journey you're at. And finally, my parting advice to graduates in particular who are trying to get started in a BIM role, just to summarize what I've spoken about, when you're applying for roles, do make it clear that you have BIM skills and you're interested in BIM, even if it's not the role you're applying for. It's worth reminding the company early on, this is something I care about, and it might trigger for them something saying, oh, okay, we can remember that, and this might be part of your career journey that we try to enable. It means that they hire you with a better understanding that this is something you're one day going to push the company towards or push your career pathway towards. It's not as much of a surprise for them if you say suddenly, I want to work in BIM, and I don't just want to be an architect or an engineer or a builder, but it gives them a bit of a signal that that's something that they might need to think about. Of course, always apply what you learn to your discipline. So don't just learn software for the sake of it. Figure out how this ties back to project delivery and coordination. Learn about the disciplinary related skills at all times, not just BIM and software. I try to really go out of my way sometimes to really observe how architects work in my industry, to understand what I need to keep learning as well. Even if I'm mostly dealing with automation these days, it really helps to see how people work so I can understand what that automation needs to capture. So do try to keep things tied back to your company. And I think it's really important that you constantly communicate with your firm, with your project leaders, with your mentors, about your intended career pathway at all times, but do be patient. It's probably my biggest piece of advice. Patience is a virtue, and it is necessary in forming a good and stable career. So that's all for today. You can find all my scripts and resources over on my GitHub at Aussie BIM Guru. And if you do have any questions about this video or some video requests, feel free to let me know. But otherwise, I look forward to seeing you next week. In the next video, we will be going technical next week with Pyrevit. But I thank you for watching, and I look forward to seeing you in future similar videos. Thanks. Take care. Bye.